Welcome to Ain Cinema, your destination for endless entertainment and unforgettable movie moments. Discover exciting films, inspiring stories, and cinematic journeys across every genre. Whether you love action, drama, thrillers, or timeless favorites, there's always something waiting for you here. Sit back, enjoy the experience, and let Ain Cinema bring the magic of movies to your screen. The Delta Force brought together an unusual combination of established Hollywood veterans and one of the biggest action stars of the 1980s. Released in 1986, the film was built primarily around Chuck Norris and Marvin, while its supporting cast featured performers whose careers stretched across several decades. This blend gave the movie a sense of weight that set it apart from many other action productions of the period. Norris delivered the martial arts and physical action audiences expected, while Marvin and the supporting actors brought the authority and dramatic experience associated with classic Hollywood. Chuck Norris stars as Major Scott McCoy, the film's central action hero. By 1986, Norris had already become one of America's most recognizable martial arts stars. His early appearances included Way of the Dragon, where he famously fought Bruce Lee inside the Roman Colosseum. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Norris developed his own screen identity through films such as Good Guys Wear Black, The Octagon, An Eye for an Eye, and Lone Wolf McQuade. His relationship with Canon Films pushed his popularity even further through Missing in Action and its sequel. McCoy represented an almost perfect Chuck Norris character, quiet, disciplined, patriotic, and suspicious of military bureaucracy, yet completely dependable when lives are at stake. Norris was never primarily celebrated for elaborate dramatic performances. His strength was his physical presence and his ability to communicate determination without relying on lengthy dialogue. The Delta Force takes full advantage of this image. McCoy remains controlled and restrained for much of the film before transforming into an almost unstoppable force during the final rescue operation. The specially equipped motorcycle he uses during the climax turns him into something approaching a comic book military hero. The film helped strengthen Norris's position as one of Canon's most valuable action stars. He continued working extensively with the company, appearing in productions including Firewalker, Missing in Action 3, and Hero and the Terror. The Delta Force also became one of the films most closely associated with Norris's 1980s screen persona. Years later, he would reach an even larger television audience through Walker, Texas Ranger, where many of the same qualities seen in Scott McCoy returned: discipline, patriotism, martial arts ability, and a clear division between heroes and villains. Standing beside Norris was Marvin as Colonel Nick Alexander, commander of the Delta Force team. Marvin brought an entirely different generation of action cinema to the picture. Long before Chuck Norris became a star, Marvin had established himself as one of Hollywood's great tough guy actors. His career included The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, The Professionals, Point Blank, and The Dirty Dozen. He had also won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Cabaloo. His gravelly voice, weathered appearance, and natural military authority made him immediately believable as Colonel Alexander. The pairing of Marvin and Norris effectively connected two eras of action filmmaking. Marvin represented the hard-edged war movies and westerns of the 1960s and 1970s. While Norris represented the increasingly exaggerated action cinema of the 1980s, Alexander functions as the experienced commander, while McCoy becomes the warrior who carries the mission directly into enemy territory. Marvin does not attempt to compete with Norris physically. Instead, his presence gives the Delta Force organization credibility and command authority. The Delta Force became especially significant in Marvin's career because it was his final feature film. He died in 1987, making Colonel Alexander his last major screen role. That fact gives his performance additional historical interest. Marvin had spent much of his career portraying soldiers, gunfighters, criminals, and hardened authority figures, so ending his film career as the commander of an elite military unit feels strangely appropriate. Forster had already established himself through films such as Medium Cool and had earned a reputation as a dependable leading and character actor. In The Delta Force, he faced the challenging task of portraying a threatening opponent capable of standing against the heroic image surrounding Chuck Norris. His performance is controlled rather than constantly explosive. Agile can appear calm and calculating one moment, then suddenly turn violent, creating tension throughout the film's extended hijacking sequences. Forster's career would later experience a major revival when Quentin Tarantino cast him as Max Cherry and Jackie Brown. That performance earned him an Academy Award nomination and introduced him to a new generation of viewers. Looking back, The Delta Force represents an interesting point in the middle period of his career. Years before that celebrated comeback, Martin Balsam plays Ben Kaplan, one of the passengers caught in the hijacking. Balsam was already an enormously respected character actor, with credits including 12 Angry Men, Psycho, and All the President's Men. He had also won an Academy Award for 8,000 Clowns. His presence gives the hostage portion of the movie additional emotional credibility. Ben Kaplan is not an action hero. Instead, he represents the frightened civilian whose survival depends on the decisions being made around him. Shelley Winters plays Ben's wife, Edie Kaplan. Winters was another Academy Award-winning veteran with an extraordinary career that included A Place in the Sun, The Diary of Anne Frank, Lolita, and The Poseidon Adventure. Casting her alongside Balsam helps make the passengers feel like important characters rather than anonymous victims simply waiting to be rescued. George Kennedy appears as Father Ollie. Kennedy was familiar to audiences from Cool Hand Luke, Airport, and numerous action and disaster films. Like Balsam and Winters, his presence connects the Delta Force to an older tradition of large-scale Hollywood ensemble productions. Joey Bishop plays Harry Goldman, while Lainie Kazan portrays Sylvia Goldman, adding further recognizable personalities to the passenger group. Robert Vaughn appears as General Woodbridge, already famous from The Man from UNCLE and films such as The Magnificent Seven. Vaughn brought the polished authority needed for senior military and government figures. Bo Svensson, another actor strongly associated with action cinema, plays Captain Campbell, the pilot whose aircraft becomes the center of the hostage crisis. The Delta Force arrived in theaters in 1986, at a moment when American action cinema was becoming increasingly connected to real-world terrorism, Cold War anxiety, and a renewed fascination with military power. Although the movie primarily functions as an action thriller, its cultural significance comes from the way it transformed contemporary fears into a straightforward fantasy of retaliation and rescue. Chuck Norris does not simply defeat fictional villains. Major Scott McCoy represents an idealized American response to terrorism: immediate, powerful, technologically superior, and unrestricted by political hesitation. The film was strongly inspired by the hijacking of TWA Flight 847 in June 1985. During that real incident, a passenger aircraft traveling from Athens to Rome was hijacked and diverted through several locations in the Middle East. United States Navy diver Robert Statham was murdered, while the passengers endured a prolonged hostage crisis. The Delta Force fictionalizes and dramatically reshapes elements associated with the event, turning a complicated international crisis into the foundation for an action story in which an elite American unit can ultimately rescue the hostages and punish those responsible. This connection gave the movie unusual immediacy when it was released. Audiences were watching fictional events that deliberately resembled situations they had recently seen reported on television. During the 1970s and 1980s, airline hijackings had become highly visible symbols of international terrorism. Airports, passenger aircraft, hostages, television news reports, and armed militants were already familiar images within the public imagination. The Delta Force took those recognizable images and placed them within the increasingly exaggerated language of the Hollywood action movie. The political atmosphere of the Reagan era was particularly important to the film's appeal. American popular culture during the 1980s frequently celebrated renewed military confidence following the national drama associated with Vietnam and the Iran hostage crisis. Movies such as Rambo, First Blood Part 2 presented fantasies in which American warriors could return to situations resembling earlier political failures and achieve decisive victories. The Delta Force follows a similar emotional structure. Terrorists create a humiliating crisis. Diplomacy appears inadequate, and military action eventually restores control. Chuck Norris was especially suited to this type of story because his screen persona had already become closely associated with patriotic revenge fantasies. Chuck Norris had already established a strong screen persona through films involving American prisoners in Vietnam and other action-oriented stories. The Delta Force expanded that image into the world of international counterterrorism. Scott McCoy is portrayed as a soldier who can succeed when conventional systems fail. His abilities are presented as almost limitless, and the film rarely encourages the audience to question whether the use of force is justified once the villains have been clearly identified. This straightforward approach also helps explain why the movie remains controversial. Its portrayal of Middle Eastern terrorism relies heavily on stereotypes that were common in Western action films of the era. Complex political conflicts are simplified into easily recognizable heroes and villains, while Arab and Lebanese settings often become visual shorthand for danger, instability, and violence. As a result, modern viewers may see the film both as a nostalgic example of 1980s action cinema and as a reflection of how Hollywood represented Middle Eastern conflicts during that period. The movie's cultural identity is also closely connected to Cannon films. During the 1980s, Cannon became famous for producing aggressive, commercially driven genre films that could be marketed internationally through recognizable stars, dramatic posters, and straightforward concepts. The Delta Force is one of the clearest examples of this philosophy. It combines terrorism, hostages, elite soldiers, motorcycles, explosions, martial arts, and American patriotism into a package that audiences could understand almost immediately. The image of Chuck Norris riding a specially armed motorcycle became one of the film's most memorable elements. By the final act, what begins as a relatively grounded hostage drama has transformed into spectacular action fantasy. McCoy's motorcycle fires rockets and effectively becomes an extension of the hero himself. This imagery helps cement the film in popular memory because it captures the excesses of 1980s action cinema, where realistic political fears were increasingly paired with wildly unrealistic heroic technology. The Delta Force also contributed to the growing fascination with elite military units in popular entertainment. Special operations forces offered filmmakers an ideal action concept because they combined secrecy, advanced weapons, specialized training, and small groups of highly capable soldiers. The real Delta Force remains surrounded by mystery, allowing popular culture to fill in the gaps with fictional interpretations. Movies, television programs, novels, and later video games increasingly portrayed Special Forces operators as almost superhuman professionals capable of operating anywhere in the world. The film's influence is less about creating an entirely new genre and more about becoming a recognizable example of an existing cultural trend. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, hostage rescue, terrorism, and special operations became recurring subjects in action entertainment. Later films would generally approach these themes with greater technical realism, but the Delta Force represents an earlier period when military authenticity could freely coexist with martial arts, enormous explosions, and heroic fantasy. Its place in Chuck Norris's popular culture became even more significant over time. Norris eventually developed a second life as an internet icon during the 2000s, when the famous Chuck Norris jokes exaggerated his toughness into impossible feats. These jokes were not created specifically because of the Delta Force, but films like it provided perfect material for that mythology. Scott McCoy survives overwhelming opposition, defeats terrorists almost single-handedly, and operates machinery that seems specifically designed to make Chuck Norris look unstoppable. As a result, scenes and images from the film gained an additional layer of humorous appeal for younger audiences. The production of the Delta Force was closely connected to the extraordinary rise of Cannon films during the 1980s. Directed by Menahem Golan, who was also one of Cannon's leading figures alongside his cousin Yoram Globus, the film was designed as both a large-scale international action picture and a vehicle for Chuck Norris. By 1986, Norris had become one of Cannon's most valuable stars, particularly following the success of his earlier action films. The Delta Force gave the company an opportunity to place Norris in a much larger production featuring aircraft, military vehicles, international locations, explosions, hostages, and an unusually prestigious supporting cast. Menahem Golan was not a filmmaker known for subtlety. His approach was energetic, emotional, commercial, and frequently excessive, and that personality can be felt throughout the Delta Force. The first half of the film resembles a tense hijacking drama, while the second gradually transforms into an almost comic book-style military adventure. Instead of maintaining a consistently realistic tone, Golan combines suspense, political drama, war film imagery, martial arts action, motorcycle stunts, and enormous explosions. This unusual structure became one of the movie's defining characteristics. The screenplay was written by James Bruner and Menahem Golan. Its central hijacking scenario was heavily inspired by contemporary terrorism, particularly the 1985 hijacking of TWA Flight 847. The filmmakers took recognizable elements from real events and built a fictional story around them. This gave the production a strong sense of urgency because the subject matter was still extremely recent when the film was being developed. Cannon was known for moving projects quickly, and the Delta Force reflects the company's ability to transform current events into commercially accessible entertainment. One of the most important production decisions was to film extensively in Israel. Cannon's founders had strong connections to the Israeli film industry, and the country offered locations that could convincingly represent several different Middle Eastern environments. Much of the production was based around Israeli locations, with areas near Tel Aviv and Jerusalem contributing significantly to the film's visual identity. The landscape, architecture, roads, military facilities, and Mediterranean surroundings allowed the filmmakers to create the fictional journey through Lebanon without having to construct every location from scratch. Ben Gurion Airport was particularly valuable to the production. Airport environments are difficult and expensive to recreate convincingly, especially when a story requires passenger aircraft, runways, military activity, vehicles, and large numbers of extras. Access to authentic aviation locations helped give the hijacking sequences a scale that would have been difficult for Cannon to achieve entirely on studio sets. Aircraft became essential production elements because so much of the first half depends on the audience believing that dozens of passengers are trapped inside a functioning commercial airliner. The aircraft sequences also required a very different filmmaking style from the later action scenes. Inside the plane, physical space is deliberately restricted. Characters are trapped in narrow aisles and rows of seats, meaning the tension has to come from performances, editing, weapons, dialogue, and the hijacker's movement through the cabin. Golan spends considerable time introducing individual passengers so that the audience understands who is in danger. This creates an almost disaster movie structure before the Delta Force itself becomes the dominant focus. Casting veteran performers was another important behind-the-scenes decision. Marvin, Martin Balsam, Shelley Winters, George Kennedy, Joey Bishop, Robert Vaughn, and other recognizable actors gave the movie a level of Hollywood history that was unusual for a canon action production. Instead of filling the aircraft entirely with anonymous extras, the filmmakers surrounded the crisis with familiar faces. Their experience was particularly useful during the lengthy hostage sequences, where dramatic tension depended more on reactions and personalities than on physical action. Marvin's participation carried special significance. His long association with military films made him an ideal choice for Colonel Nick Alexander. Marvin had already portrayed the hardened American soldier in movies such as The Dirty Dozen, so audiences immediately understood the authority he brought to the role. His health was declining during the final years of his life, which meant the production could not treat him like a younger action performer. Chuck Norris handled the demanding physical heroics, while Marvin provided the necessary command presence. The Delta Force ultimately became Marvin's final theatrical film. Chuck Norris, meanwhile, was performing a role at the height of his canon period. The production was structured around his established strengths, particularly martial arts and screen combat. Scott McCoy was not required to deliver long dramatic speeches because Norris communicated primarily through physical confidence and controlled intensity. Once the rescue operation begins, the film increasingly isolates McCoy from the larger unit, allowing the audience to watch the star perform the kind of individual action that had become central to his popularity. The most famous production creation was McCoy's heavily armed motorcycle. Rather than giving Norris an ordinary military vehicle, the filmmakers created a machine that functions almost like a superhero weapon. It carries rockets and allows McCoy to attack enemy vehicles while moving at high speed. The motorcycle represents Cannon's willingness to sacrifice realism for spectacle. By the climax, the movie is no longer attempting to recreate a completely plausible counterterrorism operation. Instead, it delivers the exaggerated action imagery promised by a Chuck Norris vehicle. Coordinating these sequences required stunt performers, controlled explosions, vehicle choreography, and careful camera placement. Cars overturn, buildings explode, motorcycles race through hostile territory, and soldiers exchange sustained gunfire. These effects were achieved practically, giving the action the physical texture associated with 1980s filmmaking. Explosions had to occur near performers and vehicles rather than being added digitally afterward. As a result, precise coordination between actors, stunt teams, drivers, camera crews, and effects technicians was essential. The film's scale also reflects Cannon's unusual ambitions during this period. The Delta Force has a distinctive narrative structure because it effectively operates as two different kinds of movies joined together. The opening sections are constructed as a military and hostage thriller, emphasizing fear, uncertainty, and the vulnerability of civilians. The second half gradually transforms into a large-scale action and rescue adventure centered increasingly on Chuck Norris. This shift creates an uneven but distinctive rather than beginning with non-stop action. The film spends considerable time establishing the hijacking and its victims before finally allowing the Delta Force soldiers to launch their assault. The story begins by introducing Major Scott McCoy and Colonel Nick Alexander during a military operation in the Middle East. McCoy is immediately presented as an exceptional soldier, but the mission also reveals his frustration with decisions made by commanders far removed from the battlefield. When circumstances turn disastrous, McCoy risks his own life to rescue members of his trapped unit. The sequence immediately establishes the central characteristics that define him throughout the movie: loyalty, courage, independence, and a willingness to disregard conventional limitations when lives are at stake. After the operation, McCoy leaves the Delta Force. This is an important narrative choice because the hero initially rejects the institution, only to be asked later to serve again. His departure establishes the familiar action film archetype of the reluctant warrior. McCoy does not need to prove that he has the necessary skills. The opening has already demonstrated his abilities. Instead, the story must create a crisis serious enough to persuade him to return. That crisis begins aboard American Travelways Flight 282. Traveling from Athens toward Rome and eventually the United States, two armed terrorists seize control of the aircraft, with Abdul Rafi emerging as the principal hijacker, supported by Mustafa. From this point, the narrative largely leaves McCoy behind and focuses on the passengers, crew, and terrorists. For an extended stretch, the Delta Force becomes a claustrophobic hostage drama. This section builds tension through restriction rather than spectacle. The passengers have nowhere to escape. Flight attendants must follow the hijackers' orders while trying to protect those around them. The terrorists control movement, information, and communication, turning the aircraft itself into a prison. Because the audience spends so much time inside the cabin, individual passengers gradually become recognizable personalities rather than an anonymous crowd. One of the darkest developments occurs when the hijackers begin identifying Jewish passengers. A flight attendant is forced to help separate people according to their names and backgrounds. The sequence deliberately creates discomfort instead of conventional action movie excitement. It evokes historical memories of persecution while demonstrating the terrorists' ability to control and humiliate both passengers and crew. The emotional focus temporarily shifts away from military heroism and towards civilian vulnerability. The aircraft is diverted to Beirut, where the situation becomes increasingly complicated. Additional militants become involved, and selected hostages are removed from the plane. The geographical movement of the aircraft is important to the structure because every landing changes the tactical situation. Authorities may believe they were approaching an opportunity to intervene, only for the terrorists to change the circumstances again. The hijacking therefore becomes a prolonged contest involving intelligence, timing, and uncertainty. Once the American government responds, Colonel Alexander's Delta Force unit is deployed. McCoy agrees to return, reconnecting the hero with the main storyline. By this point, the audience understands both sides of the coming confrontation. We have witnessed the hostages suffering through the crisis, and we have seen the soldiers preparing to intervene. This parallel structure creates anticipation because the rescue force possesses enormous capability but cannot simply attack without knowing where the hostages are being held. The first major intervention does not immediately deliver the straightforward victory expected from a conventional Chuck Norris action movie. Information is incomplete, the terrorists remain mobile, and the hostages are divided. This delay is crucial to the film's pacing. The Delta Force is powerful, but the narrative repeatedly prevents that power from being used effectively. The frustration experienced by the soldiers mirrors the frustration deliberately created for the audience. As the aircraft portion of the crisis changes, the story expands geographically. The remaining hostages are held in Beirut, forcing the Delta Force to enter hostile territory. This marks the movie's major structural transition. The enclosed suspense of the aircraft gives way to streets, buildings, military vehicles, gun battles, and pursuit sequences. The story becomes less focused on the psychology of captivity and more concerned with the mechanics of the rescue. McCoy increasingly emerges as the primary action hero. Although Alexander commands the larger operation, McCoy becomes the character who penetrates enemy positions and directly confronts the terrorists. This follows the star-driven logic of 1980s action cinema. The military unit provides scale and credibility, but the story eventually needs Chuck Norris to become the decisive individual. The armed motorcycle becomes particularly important during this transformation. Earlier scenes treat terrorism with relative seriousness, but McCoy's specialized motorcycle signals that the movie has entered a more exaggerated form of action fantasy. Equipped for high-speed combat, the vehicle allows him to attack enemy positions while remaining constantly mobile. The pacing accelerates significantly as dialogue and negotiation give way to movement. Explosions, gunfire, and pursuit. The rescue operation provides the story's major payoff. The hostages, who have spent much of the movie powerless and afraid, finally become the focus of direct military action. Because the narrative has invested so much time in showing their fear and mistreatment, their eventual liberation carries far more emotional weight than it would have if they had only been introduced shortly before the assault. On the surface, the Delta Force may appear to be a straightforward action movie about American soldiers rescuing hostages from terrorists. Beneath its explosions, gun battles, and martial arts sequences, however, are several themes that reflect the political atmosphere of the 1980s. The film explores heroism, terrorism, patriotism, revenge, helplessness, military power, sacrifice, prejudice, and the desire to restore a sense of control after national humiliation. These ideas are rarely presented with a subtle ambiguity. Instead, the film uses clear heroes and villains to create an emotional fantasy in which fear and uncertainty can eventually be defeated through courage and decisive action. Only of the strongest themes is a conflict between helplessness and power. During the hijacking, ordinary civilians are completely dependent upon armed men who control the aircraft. The passengers cannot determine where they're going, when they can move, or whether they will survive. Even governments and military forces initially appear powerless because attacking the aircraft could result in the deaths of the people they are attempting to save. The film spends a considerable time establishing the sense of frustration before reversing Ida during the rescue operation. Scott McCoy represents the opposite of helplessness. He is presented as a man who can act when institutions hesitate. His physical abilities, confidence, and determination make him a symbol of individual power. Whenever McCoy enters the action, uncertainty begins to disappear. Problems that seem politically complicated are transformed into physical obstacles that can be overcome. This is one reason Chuck Norris is so important to film. His existing screen image allows McCoy to function not merely as a soldier, but as an almost mythological representation of decisive action. Patriotism is another central theme. The Delta Force presented the soldiers as protectors rather than conquerors. Their mission is framed around rescuing civilians who have been placed in danger simply because they were traveling aboard an American aircraft. Military force therefore becomes associated with protection, a responsibility, and national loyalty. The American flag, uniforms, aircraft, military equipment, and organized rescue force all contribute to this patriotic identity. The film's patriotism is closely connected to political mood of the Reagan-era. American action movies of the period frequently imagine situations in which national confidence could be restored through military success. The trauma of Vietnam, the Iran hostage crisis, and international terrorism remain part of the cultural background. Films could symbolically reverse feelings of political frustration by creating heroes who achieve clear victories. The Delta Force participates strongly in this tradition. McCoy's relationship with military authority introduces a related theme: loyalty to people rather than unquestioning loyalty to institutions. At the beginning, He leaves the Delta Force after becoming frustrated with the decisions that endangered soldiers. His departure does not mean he has rejected his country or his fellow servicemen. Instead, it establishes that his moral loyalty exists independently of our bureaucracy. When civilians are threatened, he returns because protecting lives matters more to him than his previous disagreement with the command. This makes McCoy a familiar type of action hero. He operates inside an institution, but is never completely controlled by it. The movie suggests that organizations need exceptional individuals capable of making their own decisions. Colonel Alexander represents a responsible command authority. Willie McCoy represents instinctive action. Their partnership allows the film to celebrate both military organization and individual independence. The hostages symbolize civilian vulnerability. Their ordinary backgrounds are important because they were not warriors participating in a conflict. They are travelers suddenly trapped inside a political struggle they cannot control. The aircraft itself becomes a powerful symbol of this condition. Commercial aviation normally represents freedom, an international movement, and a technological progress. Once hijacked, however, the plane becomes a prison. The same machine designed to transport the people across borders now prevents them from escaping. Movement is therefore used symbolically throughout the movie. The terrorists control the aircraft's movement during the first half, deciding where it lands and when it departs. Later, the Delta Force regains control through its own vehicles, helicopters, military transports, and especially employees' motorcycle. Control over movement becomes equivalent to control over the situation. The heroes become victorious when they can move freely while restricting the enemy. McCoy's motorcycle is the most exaggerated symbol in the film. On a realistic level, its weapons and capabilities push all the movie toward fantasy. Symbolically, however, it is perfectly suited to the hero. Unlike a large military vehicle, the motorcycle is fast, individual, and independent. McCoy does not need an entire crew to operate it. The machine extends his physical abilities and transforms one soldier into a highly mobile attack force. It represents the film's ideal of individual power supported by advanced technology. The motorcycle also helps create almost a Western-style imagery. McCoy becomes a modern rider crossing hostile territory, except his horse has been replaced by a technologically enhanced machine. The connection to Western is significant because the Delta Force follows an old narrative pattern. Innocent people are threatened. Civilization appears vulnerable, and a highly capable warrior enters dangerous territory to restore order. Revenge is another important theme. Although the film presents it as justice, the rescue of the hostages is the official objective, but the narrative also encourages the audience to desire punishment for the terrorists after spending so much time watching the civilians being threatened and humiliated. Simply allowing the villains to disappear or provide little emotional satisfaction. The visual style of the Delta Force reflects the unusual combination of genres that defines the movie itself. Released in 1986 and directed by Manang Gulan, the film moves between military drama, hostage thriller, war movie, and exaggerated action spectacle. Its cinematography changes along with those different sections. The early scenes emphasize danger and military confusion. The aircraft sequences create claustrophobia through restricted spaces, and the final rescue expands into open locations filled with vehicles, explosions, gunfire, and movement. Rather than maintaining one carefully controlled visual identity, the movie adjusts its imagery according to the kind of excitement each section is attempting to create. The opening military operation immediately establishes a harsh environment, dusty landscapes, military vehicles, helicopters, smoke, and the soldiers create the impression of a dangerous Middle Eastern battlefield. The photography favors practical surroundings rather than highly polished studio imagery. This gives a sequence of a physical quality. The audience sees soldiers operating within landscape as aware heat, distance, mechanical equipment, and enemy fire all appear capable of becoming threats. Scott McCoy is introduced visually as a man who remains effective within chaos. The camera repeatedly emphasizes Chuck Norris through direct framing and a physical action rather than elaborate dialogue. His body language is important to the visual storytelling. McCoy appears controlled while events around her become increasingly dangerous. The contrast becomes a recurring technique throughout the film. Other characters react to circumstances. While McCoy often appears visually composed before suddenly moving into action, the aircraft hijacking creates a dramatic change in visual language. Once the terrorists take control, the movie spends long periods inside a commercial passenger cabin. The narrow environment naturally limits camera movement. Seats, overhead compartments, aisles, windows, and doors create visual boundaries throughout the frame. Characters' area frequently photographed with other passengers or objects surrounding them, reinforcing the feeling that nobody has enough room to escape. The central aisle becomes especially important under normal circumstances. It is simply the pathway passengers use to move through the aircraft. During the hijacking, it becomes territory controlled by the armed men. When a terrorist walks down the aisle, everyone seated nearby becomes vulnerable. The repeated use of this narrow central space gives a villain's visual dominance because they can move while the hostages remain seated. Close-ups also become more important during these sequences. The movie needs to communicate fear through faces because large-scale physical action is temporarily impossible. Reactions from passengers, flight attendants, and hijackers provide much of the tension. A frightened glance can reveal information that characters cannot safely express through dialogue. The camera therefore turns a cabin into a collection of individual emotional experiences. The lighting aboard the aircraft generally maintains enough realism for the location to remain recognizable while allowing the filmmakers to isolate faces and weapons when necessary. The visual atmosphere is not heavily stylized. This relative simplicity benefits the suspense because the environment resembles an ordinary passenger plane. The horror comes from seeing a familiar civilian space transformed by the presence of firearms and threats. The separation selected passengers is visually effective because the act of standing, moving down the island leaving a larger group becomes threatening in itself. The movie does not need complex effects to make these moments uncomfortable. The geometry of the cabin communicates the imbalance of power. Those seated area trapped, those standing with weapons who possess authority. And anyone ordered to move becomes immediately exposed. When the story shifts toward the Delta Force rescue operation, the cinematography becomes increasingly expansive. Open roads, urban locations, military installations, buildings, and landscape has replaced the narrow aircraft interior. This expansion in physical space parallels the changing balance of power. The hostages spent much of the first half confined while the soldiers operate through movement. The heroes drive, fly, run, infiltrate, and attack locations. The shooting in Israel contributes greatly to the film's appearance. Rather than relying exclusively on artificial studio environments, the production could use the existing roads, architecture, landscapes, and aviation facilities to create the Middle Eastern setting. The strong daylight found in many exterior scenes give the action a bright, exposed quality. Danger frequently occurs in a clear visibility rather than being hidden by darkness. This is particularly important during vehicle sequences, cars, motorcycles, military transports, and aircraft need geographical space for the audience to understand theory movement. Wider shots establish a direction and distance before closer images emphasize Norris or individual moments of combat. The editing Lainie combines these perspectives to create momentum. Nkoi's motorcycle is the movie's most recognizable visual object. Its design immediately separates it from ordinary transportation. Once the weapons are revealed, the motorcycle becomes almost a science fiction or a comic book device placed inside a military action movie. Chuck Norris riding directly toward enemies while launching attacks became an image capable of representing the entire film. The motorcycle also changes how Nkoi can be photographed. He is no longer simply a soldier moving with a unit. He becomes a solitary figure traveling rapidly through open territory. Wider compositions can show him approaching enemy positions while tighter shots preserve Norris as the center of the action. This creates a visual impression that one man possesses the mobility and a destructive capability normally associated with larger force. Practical effects are essential to the final act. The Delta Force belongs to an era before computer-narrated imagery became the standard method for creating large action sequences. The Delta Force was released in 1986 during the height of the American action boom, but the reception revealed a major division between professional critics and the audience attracted to Chuck Norris and canon films. Critics frequently attack the movie for its politics, stereotypes, excessive length, tonal inconsistency, and transformation of serious terrorism scenario into an exaggerated revenge fantasy. At the same time, the film found an audience that responded to its direct approach. Recognizable cast, patriotic themes, and spectacular second half. This contrast would become an important part of its long-term reputation. One of the most common criticisms concern the film's unusual structure. The Delta Force runs considerably longer than many straightforward action movies, yet, Chuck Norris is not constantly at the center of the story. A substantial portion of the first half concentrates on the hijacked passenger aircraft. The terrorist flight crew and hostages receive extensive screen time while Scott McCoy and the military rescue force remain comparatively distant from immediate crisis. Reviewers expecting a continuous Chuck Norris action vehicle. This could make the movie feel slow. The opening promises military action, but the story then settles into a prolonged hostage drama. Only later does it transform into the kind of explosive action movie advertised by Norris's presence. Some critics consider these sections poorly balanced, arguing that the film effectively combines a grim terrorism thriller with a much less realistic action fantasy. The tonal transition was particularly controversial. The hijacking material contained scenes of intimidation, discrimination, fear, and murder inspired by recognizable real-world terrorism. The second half eventually features Chuck Norris racing through enemy territory on a motorcycle equipped with weapons. The difference is enormous. What begins with an attempt to exploit the tension of contemporary international events eventually approaches comic book spectacle for supporters. However, that transformation is precisely what makes the Delta Force memorable. The first half establishes a situation in which civilians are almost completely powerless. The second half delivers the emotional reversal. The audience has spent so long watching the terrorists dominate the passengers that the arrival of overwhelming military retaliation becomes a form of dramatic release. From this perspective, the long build-up makes the eventual action more satisfying. Political criticism was even more significant. The film appeared only a short time after the hijacking of Flight 847. and the similarities very impossible to ignore. Critics question the decision to transform events resembling a recent tragedy into a commercial action entertainment. The real hostage crisis involved complicated political circumstances and genuine suffering. The Delta Force simplifies the environment into a story designed to produce clear villains, clear heroes, and a decisive American victory. The depiction of Arabs and Middle Eastern politics also attracted criticism. The terrorists are presented through broad characteristics that were already common in Western action cinema. Their motivations receive far less attention than their cruelty, and the surrounding region is frequently represented as an environment dominated by militants and instability. This approach made the conflict immediately understandable for an action audience, but it also reinforced stereotypes. Robert Forster's performance as Abdul-Rafi nevertheless provides a principal villain with more a personality than many of the anonymous fighters surrounding him. Abdul can appear controlled and calculating rather than simply screaming threats. His calmness makes some of his actions more disturbing. Still, the screenplay ultimately needs him to function as an enemy for McCoy to defeat rather than as a psychologically complex political character. Critics also respond strongly to the movie's patriotic perspective. The Delta Force presents American military intervention as a solution to a crisis that diplomacy and negotiation cannot adequately resolve. Once the soldiers are free to act, the story moves toward victory. For audiences who share the film's political mood, this could be exhilarating. For critics skeptical of simplistic military fantasies, it could appear propagandistic. Chuck Norris himself received the kind of divided response that characterized much his film career. His admirers appreciated his physical confidence, martial arts background, and uncomplicated heroic persona. Critics who preferred greater dramatic complexity often found his performance limited. Scott McCoy is intentionally restrained and Norris rarely attempts to turn him into a deeply conflicted personality. The character exists primarily as an idealized professional warrior. Marvin received attention partly because his appearance carried enormous historical weight. By this point, Marvin had been associated with the tough soldiers and anti-heroes for decades. His presence as Colonel Nick Alexander immediately gave the Delta Force unit authority. In retrospect, his performance became especially significant because the Delta Force was his final theatrical feature before his death in 1987. The supporting cast was one of the production's most respected elements. Martin Balsam, Shelley Winters, George Kennedy, Robert Vaughn, A. Joey Bishop, and other established performers gave the hostage sequences a surprising amount of Hollywood prestige. Several had careers reaching back to the classical studio era or the major films of the 1950s and 1960s. Their presence helped make the passengers more memorable than the anonymous victims often found in action movies. Alanis Silvestri's music became another highly recognizable aspect of the film. His energetic main theme openly embraces heroism and momentum. For some viewers, the score contributes to the film's excessive quality because it makes the Delta Force appear almost mythological. For others, that is exactly its appeal. The theme became one of the elements most capable of generating nostalgia among viewers who encountered the movie during the 1980s or through later television and home video releases. Commercially, the Delta Force became only of the better-known titles associated with canon films and Chuck Norris. Even though it was not comparable to the decade's biggest studio blockbusters, its value to canon extended beyond immediate theatrical performance. Action movies that continue generating revenue internationally through television, videocassette rentals, cable broadcasts, and overseas distribution. Norris had a strong global action audience, making films such as these particularly suitable for that market. The movie did not become an award season production, nor was it designed to compete for major critical honors. Its reputation developed primarily through genre audiences and continued a circulation rather than prestigious recognition. Home video was especially important to 1980s action cinema. Films that received hostile reviews could develop extremely durable audiences on CA. They became widely available in video stores and on television. Over time, the reception of the Delta Force has therefore become more complicated than its initial critical reputation suggests. Modern viewers can approach it as an action film, a Chuck Norris vehicle, a canon film's artifact, a political time capsule, or an example of a problematic Middle Eastern representation. These interpretations can exist simultaneously. A viewer might enjoy the practical stunts and Alana Silvestri's score while still criticizing the political simplification behind the story. The movie has also acquired an element of camp. The armed motorcycle, enormous explosions, unstoppably heroics, and intensely triumphant music represent qualities that many contemporary viewers immediately associate with exaggerated 1980s action. Scenes originally intended to generate straightforward excitement can now produce both excitement and amusement. This has helped the film survive culturally because it remains entertaining even when its politics and dramatic methods feel dated. Chuck Norris's later transformation into an internet symbol of impossible toughness gave the movie another layer of retrospective appeal. Scumcoy behaves almost exactly like the exaggerated version of Norris celebrated in later jokes. He enters impossible situations, survives overwhelming opposition, and personally destroys enemies of extraordinary efficiency. The movie, therefore, feels strangely compatible with mythology that developed around its star decades afterward. The Delta Force remains a strongly divisive film because many of its greatest attractions are inseparable from its greatest weaknesses. Its simplicity makes it emotionally direct but politically shallow. Its exaggerated action makes it memorable but undermines the realism of the hostage drama. Its patriotism creates excitement for some viewers while appearing excessive to others. Its villains generate immediate attention while also reflecting stereotypes that have aged poorly. That a divided response is ultimately central to understanding the film. The Delta Force was never a neutral depiction of terrorism or military intervention. It was an aggressive piece of 1980s popular entertainment designed to convert a contemporary fear into heroic victory. Critics often rejected its methods, while action audiences embraced the fantasy it offered. Decades later, the argument remains much the same. The film can be criticized for its politics in excess while still being recognized as one of the most distinctive Chuck Norris and canon film productions of its era. The legacy of the Delta Force extends far beyond its original 1986 theatrical release. Although it was not one of the largest Hollywood blockbusters of the decade, it became one of the most recognizable films associated with Chuck Norris, canon films, and the military action cinema of the 1980s. It's a combination of international terrorism, elite soldiers, hostage rescue, patriotic imagery, practical explosions, an almost superhuman action hero created a formula that remained familiar throughout later action movies, television programs, novels, and video games. Its influence is therefore best understood not as the invention of a genre, but as an important expression of a style that became increasingly prominent. One of the film's most significant contributions was helping popularize the Delta Force name among mainstream audiences. The real United States Army Special Operations Unit had been established only a few years earlier and remained surrounded by secrecy. That mystery made it perfect for popular entertainment. The movie could imagine its soldiers also exceptionally trained operators capable of responding to international terrorist threats without audiences possessing enough public information to compare every detail with reality. The film's subversion of Delta Force is therefore deliberately mythological. Its soldiers represent the highest level of military competence. But Scott McCoy rises even above his teammates. Chuck Norris transforms a special operations soldier into an individual action icon. The Rela military organization provides a concept with authenticity, while Norris provides a fantasy. This combination became increasingly common in latter entertainment. Special Forces units offered writers an easy narrative justification for sending small groups of highly capable characters into dangerous locations around the world. Hostage rescue, counterterrorism, infiltration, intelligence gathering, and unconventional warfare could all exist within the same basic format. Later productions generally pursue a greater tactical realism, but the attraction remains similar. Elite soldiers can operate outside the limitations faced by ordinary characters. The Delta Force also belongs to a larger cycle of 1980s films that responded to American political anxiety through fantasies of military competence. Rambo, First Blood, Part 2, Missing in Action, Invasion USA, A Commando, and other action pictures created heroes who could achieve decisive victories where governments appeared slow or ineffective. The Delta Force applies this structure specifically to international terrorism. Its influence is especially visible in the hostage rescue action thriller. Later movies such as Executive Decision and Air Force One would combine aviation, terrorism, hostages, and American military or political power with significantly larger studio budgets and more technically sophisticated production. These films are not direct remakes of the Delta Force, but they occupy related territory. The trapped aircraft provides an ideal suspense environment because civilians cannot escape while rescuers must somehow reach them. The movie also contributed to Chuck Norris's long-term scream mythology. By the time the Delta Force appeared, Norris was already strongly associated with characters who confronted overwhelming opposition. Scott McCoy pushed his persona toward its most exaggerated form. He is a soldier, martial artist, rescuer, a motorcycle rider, and nearly unstoppably combatant. He does not simply participate in the operation. By the climax, he seems capable of changing the outcome almost through personal determination. That image became even more culturally significant years later when Chuck Norris developed a second career as an internet legend. The Chuck Norris Facts phenomenon portrayed him as impossibly powerful, capable of defeating enemies and even the laws of nature through sheer toughness. The jokes were created long after the Delta Force, but films like this made them understandable. Audiences already possessed decades of screen imagery in which Norris repeatedly defeated armies of villains. The armed motorcycle became one of the strongest symbols of Thea's legacy. Many action films contain motorcycles, but relatively few integrate one soul completely into the hero's identity. McCoy's machine is essentially a mobile weapons platform. Rockets and other offensive capabilities transform transportation into fantasy technology. The motorcycle has become one of the easiest images to use when illustrating the unapologetic excess of an era action film. The Delta Force was successful enough as a recognizably property to produce sequels. Delta Force 2, The Colombian Connection arrived in 1990, again starring Chuck Norris as Scott McCoy. Instead of concentrating on Middle Eastern terrorism and airline hijacking, the sequel shifted towards the international drug trade. The change demonstrated how flexible the basic concept could be. McCoy could be placed against a new global threat without requiring the original hostage scenario. A third film, Delta Force 3, The Killing a Game, followed in 1991. Chuck Norris did not return as the central star, and the production relied on a younger group of action performers. This continuation showed that Canon viewed the Delta Force name itself as commercially useful. Even without Norris, however, the original remained a film most strongly identified with the series. The franchise never developed into a massive multimedia property comparable to Rambo, but subtitle and imagery remain recognizably within action culture. Home video played a major role in sustaining that recognition. Video cassette stores gave films such as the Delta Force a lifespan far beyond their original theatrical runs. The dramatic title, Chuck Norris' image, weapons, military artwork, and explosive marketing were ideally suited to action sections in video stores. Television broadcasts later introduced the film to additional audiences. These repeated circulation helped transform it from a contemporary terrorism thriller into a nostalgic artifact of 1980s popular culture. Viewers who discovered it years after release were less likely to experience its political references as immediate news. Instead, they encountered the movie as an example of an earlier action style. Its legacy is also inseparable from Canon films. Canon became famous for ambitious productions that often combine major stars, sensational concepts, international financing, and relatively direct genre storytelling. The Delta Force also produced very different audience reactions depending on when, where, and at what age viewers encountered it. For audiences watching the film in 1986, the story was connected to immediate fears surrounding international terrorism and airline hijacking. Reviewers discovering it through television and home video during the following decades, it increasingly became a classic Chuck Norris action movie. For modern audiences, it can function simultaneously as exciting entertainment, political time capsule, an exaggerated military fantasy, and an example of attitudes that have become increasingly controversial with time. When the Delta Force originally appeared, terrorism involving commercial aviation was not an abstract cinematic concept. Highly publicized hijackings had made international air travel part of a wider atmosphere of political uncertainty. The similarities between the film and the 1985 hijacking of Flight 847 gave the fictional story additional emotional weight. Contemporary audiences could recognize the type of crisis being dramatized because comparable images had recently appeared in television news coverage. This made the first half particularly uncomfortable. The passengers are ordinary civilians traveling aboard a commercial aircraft when armed terrorists suddenly take control. There is little they can do to defend themselves. Their passports, identities, nationalities, and religious backgrounds can suddenly become matters of life and death. Viewers are encouraged to imagine themselves trapped inside the Samia cabin. The aircraft setting strengthens that identification. Almost everyone understand the basic environment of a passenger plane. Seats are closely together, exits are limited, and the passengers normally surrender a degree of control as soon as the aircraft leaves the ground. The hijacking turns those ordinary characteristics into sources of fear. The audience cannot easily imagine escaping because the characters themselves have nowhere to go. The separation of Jewish passengers was among the most disturbing elements for many viewers. These scenes introduce memories of historical persecutions that extend far beyond the immediate terrorist incident. The emotional effect comes partly from watching ordinary people suddenly categorized according to identity. The flight attendant's distress also provides the audience with a character forced into participating in something she finds morally horrifying. The veteran supporting cast increases emotional connection. Martin Balsam, Shelley Wyners, George Kennedy, Joey Bishop, and other familiar performers that carried decades of screen history with them. Older viewers could recognize actors they had watched in dramas, comedies, disaster movies, westerns, and thrillers. Seeing such familiar personalities placed in danger made the hostage group more emotionally accessible. Chuck Norris attracted a very different kind of audience response. Fans entering the theater specifically to see Norris already understood the promise associated with his name. They expected physical action, martial arts, clear villains, and eventual retaliation. The film deliberately delays that satisfaction if for long periods. McCoy cannot simply enter the aircraft and defeat every enemy responsible. That delay creates a frustration, but it is intentional. The audience spends much of the first half watching villains exercise control. By the time McCoy is finally able to act without restraint, viewers have been given numerous reasons to want the terrorists defeated. The second half therefore operates as emotional release. Fear gives way to anticipation and anticipation becomes revenge. For mania action fans, this reversal is the heart of the movie. Scott McCoy becomes a personification of the response they have been waiting to see. He does not negotiate endlessly or become trapped in a political discussion. Once he knows where the hostages are and who is responsible, he acts. The simplicity of that response made the characters satisfying to viewers who wanted escapism rather than a realistic examination of international diplomacy. American audiences during the Reagan era could also interpret the film through a broader atmosphere of renewed national confidence. Movies such as Rambo, First Blood Part 2, Missing in Action, and other military adventures present American warriors capable of overcoming situations associated with earlier national frustration. The Delta Force applies that emotional pattern to terrorism. A humiliating crisis is transformed into a decisive rescue and a victory. For some viewers, the patriotism was exhilarating. The Delta Force soldiers risk themselves to save civilians and their mission is framed as morally justified. The heroic music, uniforms, aircraft, weapons, and a military organization create a fantasy of national competence. Alan Silvester's main theme intensifies emotion by making the arrival of the soldiers feel triumphant. Other audiences interpreted exactly the same material very differently. The movie's political simplicity could appear propagandistic, particularly because the Middle Eastern conflict is reduced to an easily understood division between American heroes and Arab terrorists. Viewers seeking political complexity could find the film frustrating or offensive. The enemy rarely receives the depth required to explain the larger historical circumstances surrounding the violence. This aspect had become even more noticeable for modern audiences. Decades of political change and conflict have made representations of Middle Eastern people in Western entertainment the subject of greater examination. The Delta Force frequently uses visual and narrative stereotypes that were common in 1980s action cinema. Contemporary viewers may therefore enjoy the movie while simultaneously recognizing that some of its representations are broad and dated. International audiences could also experience the film differently from American viewers. The patriotic fantasy is constructed primarily from an American perspective, while much of the Middle East functions as dangerous territory through which the heroes must operate. A viewer's nationality, a political background, or personal understanding of the region can therefore dramatically influence how the story is interpreted. The Delta Force is driven more by action, suspense, and a clearly defined moral position than by a complicated psychological transformation, but its principal characters still follow recognizable arcs. Major Scott McCoy receives Thea Cleary's journey, moving from a disillusioned soldier who abandons a Delta force to a committed warrior who returns when innocent lives are threatened. Colonel Nick Alexandra represents duty and responsibility. Willie the passengers experience a collective journey from ordinary travelers to frightened hostages and finally survivors. The terrorists, particularly Abdullah Rifi, function differently, rather than developing toward redemption or understanding. They become increasingly exposed as a central threat that the heroes must overcome. Scott McCoy begins the movie as an exceptional soldier who has lost confidence in the military system surrounding him. The opening operation establishes that his frustration does not come from cowardice or unwillingness to serve. He risks his own life to save fellow soldiers when the mission begins collapsing. The problem is with decisions made by commanders whose mistakes place people on the ground in unnecessary danger. This distinction is essential to understanding McCoy. He is not rejecting military values. In many ways, he represents him more completely than the bureaucracy he criticizes. Loyalty, courage, sacrifice, and responsibility remain fundamental to his personality. What he rejects is authority that fails to protect the people under its command. His decision to leave Delta Force therefore establishes a conflict between institutional obedience and personal immorality. The airline hijacking provides the event capable of overcoming that conflict. When McCoy learns that innocent civilians are trapped and an elite rescue force is needed, his personal disappointment becomes less important than the lives at risk. His return is not presented as a reconciliation with every aspect of military authority. Instead, he chooses to serve because the mission itself is morally important. This creates the central development in his character. McCoy begins by believing that walking away is the only meaningful response to institutional failure. He eventually accepts that his abilities create responsibilities he cannot completely abandon. If he possesses the skills required to save people, remaining outside the fight becomes impossible once the crisis reaches sufficient seriousness. Chuck Norris plays his development with restraint. McCoy does not explain his feelings through lengthy speeches. His character is defined primarily through decisions. He rescues the soldiers, leaves the unit, returns when needed, enters hostile territory, and continues fighting until the hostages are safe. Action becomes a language through which the screenplay communicates his morality. Colonel Nick Alexander follows a quieter arc. He begins as a professional commander and remains one throughout the film. But his relationship with McCoy demonstrates his ability to understand an unconventional subordinate. Alexander recognizes that McCoy's independence can create difficulties. Yet, he also knows that those same qualities make him invaluable in extreme situations. Alexander represents the institution at its best. He contrasts with the distant decision-makers who contributed to McCoy's original frustration. Alexander is closer to his soldiers and understands the risks they face. His authority is therefore presented as legitimate because it is connected to experience and responsibility rather than merely rank. The relationship between Alexander and McCoy is built upon mutual respect. They do not require sentimental reconciliation scene because their shared history is visible in the way they interact. Alexander trusts McCoy to operate independently and McCoy is willing to return under Alexander's command. Their partnership creates a balance between organized military power and individual initiative. Abdul Rifai functions as McCoy's principal opposite, where McCoy uses violence to rescue people. Abdul uses violence to control them. Both characters demonstrate determination, but their purposes are rarely reversed within the film's framework. McCoy voluntarily enters a danger for strangers, while Abdullah deliberately places strangers in danger to achieve political objectives. Abdullah initially possesses nearly complete control inside the aircraft. He determines where passengers sit, what moves, what the crew does, and where the plane travels. His authority depends upon fear. The hostages obey because his refusal may result in death. Roberto Forster's control performance strengthens this aspect of the character because Abdul does not need to behave hysterically in every scene to appear dangerous. His arc is essentially a gradual loss of control. At the beginning of the hijacking, he possesses the initiative while governments and military forces react. As a Delta Force, he gathers information and enters the conflict. That advantage begins disappearing. By the final stages, the man who once controlled an entire aircraft becomes a target being pursued by McCoy. The reversal between McCoy and Abdul gives a narrative its personal dimension. The broader conflict involves governments, military units, and numerous militants, but the movie eventually reduces those forces to 2 individuals. Abdul represents a terror imposed upon the hostages, while McCoy represents a retaliation promised by the story. The passengers experience a development collectively rather than through conventional heroic arcs. At the beginning, they are ordinary travelers. Their concerns are personal and familiar. Once the hijacking begins, individual differences become secondary to survival. The cabin turns unrelated strangers into a temporary community united by danger. Ben and Edie Kaplan are particularly important because Martin Balsam and Shelley Winters give the hostage experience recognizably human faces. They are not trained fighters and cannot physically challenge the terrorists. Their arc is therefore about endurance rather than conquest. Survival itself becomes their objective. The separation of Jewish passengers creates another transformation. People who began the journey simply as travelers are suddenly defined by the terrorists according to religious or ethnic identity. The psychological cruelty comes from removing their individuality and placing them into a category selected for persecution. Their character experience reflects one of the movie's central concerns: innocent people being forced into a conflict they did not choose. The costume and set design of the Delta Force play an important role in creating a film's mixture of contemporary realism and exaggerated action fantasy. Unlike a historical war movie, the production did not need to recreate a distant period. Released in 1986 and inspired by contemporary international terrorism, it needed environments and clothing that audiences would immediately recognize as belonging to their own world. Commercial aircraft interiors, airport facilities, military bases, Middle Eastern streets, uniforms, civilian clothing, weapons, and vehicles all help establish this sense of immediacy. As the story becomes more spectacular, however, the design gradually moves away from everyday realism and toward the larger-than-life visual identity associated with the Chuck Norris and Cannon films. Scott McCoy's appearance is deliberately straightforward. Chuck Norris does not need an elaborate costume to establish the character because his physical image was already familiar to action audiences. McCoy's military clothing emphasizes function rather than decoration. Combat equipment, practical boots, weapons, and field clothing identify him as a professional soldier. Nothing about his appearance suggests that he is interested in displaying a status. His identity comes from competence. This simplicity also separates McCoy from traditional glamorous action heroes. He is presented as someone who belongs in difficult environments. His clothing must allow a movement, combat, motorcycle riding, and interaction with military equipment. The costume therefore supports Norris' physical performance. McCoy looks prepared to act rather than prepared to impress. Colonel Nick Alexander is visually distinguished through his more authoritative military presentation. Marvin's agent's screen history already communicate experience and a uniform reinforces his position within the chain of command. Alexander does not need the same physical costume design as McCoy because his role is different. He coordinates commands and accepts the responsibility for the larger operation. The contrast between them is subtle but effective. McCoy is the field warrior while Alexander is a commander. One is visually associated with movement and individual combat, the other with a military structure and leadership. Theater costumes communicate these roles before the screenplay needs to explain them. The remaining Delta Force soldiers are dressed to create a unified military identity. Similar combat clothing and equipment make the unit appear organized rather than like a random collection of faction characters. This is important because McCoy's individuality becomes stronger when surrounded by a visually consistent team. He belongs to the group but remains a figure to camera and a narrative gradually separate from it. The civilian costumes aboard the aircraft serve a completely different purpose. The passengers need to look ordinary. Their clothing reflects different ages, backgrounds, and personalities rather than a single visual identity. Jackets, shirts, dresses, travel clothing, and personal accessories make them appear like people who expected nothing more dangerous than an international flight. This normality is essential to the hostage drama. If the passengers look prepared for action, the sense of vulnerability would disappear. Their clothing constantly reminds the audience that these people did not choose to enter a battlefield. Violence has entered their civilian environment. The veteran performers also bring personality to these costumes. Martin Balsam and Shelley Wyners appear as recognizable older travelers rather than potential action heroes. George Kennedy, Joey Bishop, and the other supporting actors similarly contribute to the feeling of a diverse passenger group. Their appearance creates contrast with the Armada hijackers moving through the cabin. The terrorists are visually separated through weapons, clothing, physical behavior, and their control space. Theater costumes help place them within the Middle Eastern political imagery familiar to Western audiences of the period. This visual shorthand makes the threat immediately understandable, although it also contributes to stereotypes for which the movie has been criticized. Robert Forster's Abdullah is especially important because his appearance must communicate authority without turning him into an anonymous fighter. He is the terrorist leader the audience is expected to remember. His relatively controlled visual presentation complements Forster's performance. Abdul does not need a constant visual extravagance because his power initially comes in the fact that everyone around him must obey. The aircraft interior is arguably the movie's most important set. For a large portion of the running time, the passenger cabin becomes a primary dramatic environment. Its design must therefore perform several functions simultaneously. It needs to resemble a believable commercial aircraft, accommodate a large ensemble, provide space for cameras, and create the feeling that the characters cannot escape. Rows of seats become natural barriers. The central aisle creates a corridor through which the hijackers can patrol. Overhead compartments and the low ceiling reinforce a confined atmosphere. Doors become extremely important because whoever controls theme effectively controls access to the outside world. The cabin also creates a clear hierarchy of movement. The passengers remain seated while the terrorists stand and walk. The simply designed relationship makes power visible. A person with a weapon in the aisle can dominate dozens of people because the physical environment restricts everyone else's movement. The cockpit provides another controlled space, normally associated with professional authority and technological command. It becomes vulnerable once the hijackers dictate where the pilots must fly. The design of the aircraft therefore supports one of the film's central themes. Systems created for safe international transportation can be transformed into instruments of captivity. Airport locations expand the world beyond the cabin while maintaining the aviation theme. Runways, terminals, aircraft, service areas, and military activity. Given production of scale that conventional studio sets would have struggled to reproduce economically. The use of real locations in Israel helped the movie create an international atmosphere while giving the action a physical authenticity. The screenplay of The Delta Force reflects the direct storytelling style associated with Canona films and 1980s action cinema. Written by James Bruner and director Menu McGoolan, the script is less interested in complicated verbal exchanges than in establishing danger, defining heroes and villains, and moving the characters toward confrontation. Dialogue serves several practical purposes. It explains a hostage situation, establishes military objectives, gives the passengers individual personalities, and reinforces Scott McCoy's image as a man who prefers action to conversation. The screenplay is therefore most effective when words increase tension or prepare the audience for physical action. One of the script's most distinctive qualities is its division into two dramatically different forms. The first major section is dialogue heavy because the hijacking depends upon threats, commands, negotiations, and reactions. The second half increasingly replaces conversation with movement, gunfire, vehicles, and explosions. The amount and purpose of dialogue therefore change as control shifts from the terrorist to the Delta Force. Scott McCoy is written according to the established Chuck Norris screen persona. He is not a character who delivers long explanations about his beliefs. His dialogue tend to be brief and functional. The screenplay allows his decisions to communicate more than his words. When McCoy believes fellow soldiers are in danger, he acts. When he becomes disillusioned with military leadership, he leaves. When civilians require rescue, he returns. This economy benefits Norris because his greatest strength as an action star was physical presence rather than theatrical dialogue. McCoy's silence can suggest confidence. He does not need to convince the audience that he is dangerous through elaborate threats because the opening sequence has already demonstrated his abilities. The screenplay understands that anticipation becomes stronger when a hero speaks a little and the audience waits for him to act. Colonel Nick Alexander receives a dialogue with a different purpose. As a commander, he must communicate information, give orders, assess risks, and coordinate the rescue operation. Marvin's distinctive voice adds authority, even a straightforward military exposition. Alexander's dialogue therefore helps organize the complicated tactical elements of the story while simultaneously reinforcing his leadership. The contrast between Alexander and McCoy is useful. Alexander explains what the unit must accomplish while McCoy frequently becomes a persona who physically accomplishes it. Only represents command and planning while the other represents execution. Their conversations rarely need excessive emotional conflict because mutual respect is established early. The hijackers rely much more heavily on dialogue because language is one of their principal weapons. Abdul Rufai must control dozens of passengers without physically attacking every individual. Commands, threats, announcements, and demands allow him to establish authority throughout the aircraft. Robert Forster's control delivery makes these moments more effective because Abdul can sound calm while describing potentially lethal consequences. The script often uses these contrasts between calm speech and violent possibility. A terrorist does not need to shout continuously if everyone understands that disobedience may result in death. This makes some of the quieter exchanges more threatening than a conventional action dialogue. The passengers listen carefully because a few words can determine what happens next. Exposition is unavoidable because the hijacking constantly changes the location and tactical circumstances. The audience needs to understand where the aircraft is traveling, what the terrorists demand, what governments know, where hostages have been taken, And what options remain available to the military? The screenplay communicates much of this information through radio conversations, commands, briefings, and discussions between authorities. At times, this contributes to the film's slow pacing. Characters may explain circumstances that delay the action rather than immediately advancing it. However, the information also helps create the frustration central to the first half. The Delta Force possesses enormous firepower, but cannot use it effectively without reliable intelligence. Dialogue repeatedly establishes why the heroes must wait. The passenger conversations perform a different function. The large supporting cast needs to become recognizable before the rescue can carry emotional weight. Martin Balsam, Shelley Winters, Georgia Kennedy, Joey Bishop, and the other performers are given moments that establish personality and relationships. These exchanges humanize the cabin and temporarily make the movie resemble an ensemble disaster drama. Humor appears occasionally through the passengers and interactions between characters, providing relief from the sustained attention. The comedy is generally brief because too much humor would undermine the seriousness of the hijacking. The lighter moments nevertheless remind the audience that the hostages had normal personalities and relationships before violence disrupted their journey. The script becomes much darker when the terrorists begin identifying Jewish passengers. Here dialogue is used as an instrument of humiliation. Names and identities become dangerous information. The emotional power comes from ordinary questions acquiring threatening meaning because of who is asking them and why. The flight attendant's involvement adds another layer of tension. She is forced to communicate information under coercion, making dialogue itself morally painful. Words are no longer neutral. Speaking can contribute to another passenger suffering, yet refusing to cooperate could produce immediate violence. The screenplay uses the situation to create conflict without requiring physical combat. The script's treatment of the terrorists is also only of its greatest limitations. Abdullah receives a recognizable personality, but many surrounding militants remain broadly defined. Political motivations are simplified because of screenplays are designed to move toward a clear heroic confrontation rather than an extended examination of Middle Eastern politics. This makes the narrative accessible but reduces complexity. The marketing of the Delta Force reflected the aggressive promotional philosophy that made Canona Films one of the most recognizably independent studios of the 1980s. Released in 1986, the movie could be sold through a combination of elements that were immediately understandable to action audiences. Chuck Norris, Marvin, elite American soldiers, international terrorism, military weapons, explosions, and the danger of the hostage crisis. Cannon did not need to explain the film through a complicated advertising concept. The title, stars, and military imagery communicated the basic promise almost instantly. Chuck Norris was the most important commercial element. By the middle of the 1980s, his name had become a recognizable brand in action cinema. Movies such as Missing in Action, Missing Action 2, Lone Wolf McQuade, Code of Silence, and Invasion USA had established a clear expectation among audiences. A Chuck Norris film promised martial arts, gun battles, a physical toughness, and a hero capable of defeating enemies who greatly outnumbered him. Advertising could therefore sell Norris as himself almost as strongly as a story. His face and name immediately identified the intended audience. This star-driven approach was particularly valuable internationally because an action star can remain recognizable even in markets where the details of the screenplay or political background were less familiar. Marvin provided a different form of promotional value. Marvin belonged to an older generation of Hollywood masculinity and carried associations with major war films, westerns, and crime pictures. His presence gave the Delta Force a sense of prestige and a military credibility. Advertising that placed Norris and Marvin together effectively promised a combination of 2 eras of tough guy cinema. The pairing was one of film's strongest in marketing ideas. Norris represented a contemporary martial arts and canona-style action while Marvin represented the tradition of films such as The Dirty Dozen. Audiences familiar with both actors could interpret their combination as a meeting between classic war film toughness and modern action spectacle. The title itself was extremely effective. The Delta Force sounds direct, military, secretive, and powerful. It suggests an elite organization without requiring a lengthy explanation. The real Delta Force was surrounded by considerable secrecy, and that mystery gave the title additional attraction. Audiences could imagine the highly trained soldiers carrying out missions beyond the capabilities of conventional forces. Poster artwork emphasized military spectacle. Chuck Norris was naturally positioned as a principal attraction surrounded by visual suggestions of weapons, combat, vehicles, aircraft, fire, and danger. The advertising did not primarily sell the movie as a slow hostage drama, even though a substantial portion of the running time is devoted to the hijacked aircraft. Instead, promotional imagery emphasized explosive retaliation that arrives later. This created revealing a difference between the film itself and the expectations generated by its campaign. A viewer attracted by images of Norris and military action might reasonably expect him to dominate the movie from the beginning. Instead, the narrative spends considerable time within the passengers and terrorists. The marketing sold to pay off more strongly than the build-up. The motorcycle became an especially useful promotional image. McCoy's specialized machine is visually unusual enough to distinguish the Delta Force from conventional military thrillers. The motorcycle already suggests speed and individual freedom, but adding weapons transforms it into an action fantasy. Images of Norris riding immediately communicate that the movie will eventually move beyond realistic counter-terrorism procedure. Trailers similarly had the advantage of being able to concentrate the movie's most spectacular moments into a short presentation. Explosions, gunfire, a military deployment, hostages, Norris, a Marvin, and the motorcycle could be edited together rapidly. This allowed the promotional campaign to present the Delta Force as a nearly continuous action event, even though the finished film contains long stretches of suspense and dialogue. Alan Silvestri's music also strengthened the film's promotional identity. The heroic Delta Force theme communicates confidence and momentum almost immediately. Music of this kind works particularly well in trailers because it can transform disconnected action shots into a unified promise of adventure. Combined with military imagery, it makes the soldiers appear larger than life. The contemporary political context was another unofficial marketing advantage. The movie arrived when international terrorism and Lainie hijackings were prominent subjects in news coverage. Audiences did not need to be taught why an aircraft hijacking could become a major international crisis. The concept was already familiar and frightening. The film's similarities to recent real-world events also made the subject controversial. Marketing entertainment based on scenarios resembling contemporary tragedy can generate attention while simultaneously raising ethical questions. The Delta Force benefited from the immediate relevance of its premise, but that relevance also encouraged criticism that canon was converting recent saringa into commercial action spectacle. Canona Films was exceptionally skilled at selling concepts internationally. When Magul and Urim Globus understood that posters, titles, stars, and promotional artwork could help secure interest before audiences knew much about the completed film, their business model relied heavily on international distribution where recognizable genres and actors were extremely valuable. The Delta Force occupies a distinctive position within the action cinema of the 1980s because it combines several popular genres rather than belonging completely to any one of them. It's partly a hostage thriller, partly a military rescue movie, partly a terrorism drama, and eventually a larger-than-life Chuck Norris action vehicle, comparing it with films such as Missing in Action, Invasion USA, Rambo, First Blood Part 2, Commando, The Dirty Dozen, and later aviation thrillers. It reveals both how closely the Delta Force followed the trends period and how unusual its structure actually was. The most obvious comparison is with Chuck Norris's own Missing in Action series. Missing in Action, released in 1984, established one of the defining versions of Norris's canon film's persona. Colin James Braddock is a Vietnam veteran who returns to Southeast Asia to rescue American prisoners. Like Scott McCoy, Braddock is highly trained, emotionally controlled, skeptical of bureaucracy, and willing to enter hostile territory when conventional authorities fail to produce results. Both films are built around fantasies of correcting situations associated with American political frustration. Missing in Action returns symbolically to Vietnam and allows an American warrior to achieve a clear victory. The Delta Force takes contemporary fears about international terrorism and creates a similarly decisive response. In each case, a complicated geopolitical problems area transformed into physical missions that could be solved by exceptional soldier. The difference is structural. Missing in Action places Norris much more consistently at the center of the narrative. The Delta Force is more ambitious as an ensemble production. Large portions concentrate on the hijacked passengers, terrorists, flight crew, military commanders, and the international movement of the aircraft. McCoy is unquestionably the principal action hero, but the movie delays his dominance. Invasion USA, released in 1985, provides another revealing comparison. Norris plays Matt Hunter, a former intelligence operative confronting terrorists attacking the United States. Both films reflect fears about terrorism and present Norris also the individual capable of responding with overwhelming force. However, Invasion USA embraces action fantasy much earlier. Its invasion scenario is deliberately enormous, and the film rarely possesses a hostage drama seriousness found during the first half of the Delta Force. Scott McCoy and Matt Hunter are nevertheless closely related as screen heroes. Both are men of few words. Both possess abilities far beyond those of ordinary characters. Both exist partly outside conventional authority and both become symbols of retaliation. These roles help define the Chuck Norris image that would eventually become exaggerated through popular culture and internet humor. Rambo First Blood Part 2 is perhaps the most important broader comparison. Released in 1985, it became one of the defining military action films of the decade. Sylvester Stallone's John Rambo, like McCoy, is an elite warrior whose effectiveness contrasts with political and bureaucratic limitations. Both movies suggest that highly capable soldiers can succeed if they are finally allowed to act decisively. Rambo, however, is more psychologically connected to its hero. John Rambo carries visible trauma from Vietnam and has a complicated relationship with the country he serves. Scott McCoy, by comparison, is a much simpler character. His frustration with military leadership establishes his independent nature, but the Delta Force does not explore his inner life with the same depth. Instead, McCoy functions primarily as an idealized professional warrior. Commando, also released in 1985, offers another variation on the one-man army formula. Arnold Schwarzenegger's John Matrix fights to rescue his kidnapped daughter, making his mission deeply personal. McCoy, on the other hand, puts himself in danger mainly for strangers. His motivation comes from duty rather than family, which makes the Delta Force more openly military and patriotic, while Commando is built around a personal rescue fantasy. The two films also differ in their approach to action. Commando quickly embraces humor, spectacular destruction, and Schwarzenegger's overwhelming physical presence. The Delta Force spends much more time establishing a sense of realistic vulnerability before eventually reaching similar levels of excess. By the time McCoy takes control of his armed motorcycle, however, the film has entered much the same territory. The individual hero has become powerful enough to take on groups of enemies almost single-handedly. Marvin's presence also invites comparison with a Dirty Dozen. In the 1967 film, Marvin plays Major Reisman, who leads a group of military prisoners on a dangerous mission during World War II. By the time he appeared as Colonel Nick Alexander in the Delta Force, Marvin had nearly 2 decades of additional screen history behind him. His casting therefore creates an intentional or perhaps simply natural connection between the older ensemble war film and the modern action movie. The Dirty Dozen places strong emphasis on the personalities within its military group, giving its soldiers distinctive identities and individual conflicts. The Delta Force, by contrast, is much more star-centered. Alexander commands a unit, but most of the soldiers remain secondary to McCoy. The earlier film treats the team itself as one of its main attractions, whereas the 1986 movie gradually transforms its military operation into a showcase for Chuck Norris. This difference reflects a broader evolution in action cinema. Many earlier war films focused on groups of soldiers working together toward a shared objective. During the 1980s, action movies increasingly elevated individual stars into almost superhuman figures. Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Norris, and others became brands as much as performers. The Delta Force combines both traditions. Marvin represents the ensemble-driven military film, while Norris embodies the era of the individual action icon. The film's hostage storyline can also be compared with disaster movies such as Airport and its successors. Those films often brought together large casts of recognizable actors aboard aircraft or inside other dangerous environments. The Delta Force follows a similar strategy, surrounding its hijacking storyline with veteran performers such as Martin Balsam, Shelley Winters, George Kennedy, Joey Bishop, and others.